Okay, so we'll start off now. Welcome to our second Idea Social Innovation Lab webinar. My name is Dan Samosh. I'm at Queen's University in the Employment Relations Studies unit. Today we have a webinar with Susanne Bruyère. I'll introduce Susanne in a moment and share a bit about the webinar as well. But before that, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that for this webinar, captions should be available. If you're having any issues with this, please use the Q&A function to let us know and we can try to sort that out. You can also email us as well and we can try to make sure in the moment we can help with some of those things. Before we dig into the webinar as well, I want to give just a really short background on IDEA, the research and kind of practice group that we're a part of called Inclusive Design for Employment Access. Our goal is to primarily really create more inclusive labor markets for persons with disabilities and many other identities and experiences, and doing that by largely developing evidence-informed tools, resources through co-design with partners. So this webinar is a part of our speaker series, and our goal with this is to be really practical, which is in part, I'm really excited that our second one is with Susanne Bruyère because Susanne has done some amazing work in this kind of knowledge to practice space. We're going to hear just a bit about the work that she's done. If you do for future webinars have an idea of like, hey, you should really have this person or someone else on, please let us know. Please send us an email to let us know who you'd like to learn from on our webinar series. And our plan is to run the webinars monthly. So we have another webinar coming up in February, and I'll tell you about that at the end of this webinar. We'll also be recording these webinars and posting them online at some point soon. So in terms of webinar structure, we have 1 hour today, and we'll keep time for your questions at the end. When you do have questions at the end, please use the Q&A function. You can do that throughout the webinar as well. And I, along with the team in the background, will be monitoring the Q&A, and then we'll ask the questions of Susanne later. So from there, right, we have Susanne Bruyère with us today. Susanne is a professor of disability studies at Cornell University, also the director of the Yang Institute on Employment and Disability. And the title of Suzanne's talk today is Neurodiversity in the Workplace. So over to you, Susanne.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And thanks to our sponsors of this event. I'm delighted to have been invited to contribute to the series. I think it's a wonderful contribution to raising awareness about research in the area of employment and disability, and I'm pleased to be a part of that. As Dan said, the topic I'm going to be focused on is one I have been more concertedly focused on in the last 7 or 8 years, neurodiversity in the workplace, and I'll talk about why that has been. First, a little bit about our team, the context that I'm speaking to you from. As Dan mentioned, I am the academic director of the Yang Institute on Employment and Disability, and our institute is housed in under the umbrella of the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, ILR, at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. That's the campus I'm located on. And our focus is maximizing full inclusion of people with disabilities, focus on employment, but also in the greater context of civil society. We're an enterprise unit. That means that we are self-supporting through grants and contracts under the sponsorship of the ILR School. And we, as Dan mentioned, we're very pleased that our model is to conduct research as universities are focused on doing, but also to do a lot with knowledge translation of the findings of our research. And we do a great deal of diffusion activities, this being an example of how we try to take our research and make it more openly available and more user accessible to a broader audience. We have a very multidisciplinary team of 70 people. That image doesn't reflect all of our team, but we have economists, psychologists, special educators, statisticians, and many practitioners who work in the field that help us to translate our research to tools that are more applicable to the broader stakeholder audience that we serve. So that's a bit about the context that I'm coming to you from today. I'm in my Ithaca office, as you can see in the background. So in our time together today, here is an overview of what I hope to accomplish, some of the questions that I'm coming to answer. First, why an interest, as I mentioned, in neurodiverse job applicants and employees? Why is this the target audience of target area population for focus? What is neurodiversity, in case for some of you that is a new topic? What are some considerations specifically in the recruitment process, where we've done more concerted focus in the last few years, but also more broadly, what are ways to improve that interview experience of neurodiverse candidates and subsequently to improve the success of neurodiverse employees throughout employment as well. So we will talk a bit about the broader employment process, although we will have a focus on recruitment and interviewing and hiring. And with that, assuming that there is a pretty broad audience participating with us today, what are the implications for employers, employer representatives like recruiters, managers, co-workers, and individuals themselves with autism? So why an interest in neurodiversity? We have been, since the passage of the ADA and before in 1990, been looking broadly at workplace disability inclusion and continue to do so in the ILR School and at the Yang Tan Institute. But in the last 7 or 8 years have been more concertedly taking what we've learned in that broader inquiry over the last 30 plus years and parlaying that toward a better understanding what's happening with people who are neurodivergent. And there's a number of reasons why we have done so. First of all, we look at the prevalence rates of this population for children with autism. It has moved to 1 in 36 in the most recent statistics from our U.S. Centers for Disease Control. This is 2023 statistics, but from data gathered in 2020. And as we look over the last 10 years, this is an increase of over 300%. So this is a staggering jump in the population. We're not exactly sure whether it's better diagnosis or indeed there is a higher prevalence rate, but it is certainly something to pay attention to. It is estimated more broadly, and those are autism statistics. We are now looking more broadly at the larger population of what's umbrellaed under the term of neurodiversity. And in that broader umbrella, it's estimated to be approximately 1 in 5 of the general population using US statistics. And that seems to generalize to other countries, other settings as well, that keeps these kinds of statistics. And it's of concern to us in the Yang Tan Institute and the ILR School because individuals with autism are significantly underemployed. So not only is it an increasingly large proportion of young people, but when they reach school age and employment age, they are disproportionately not able to get into the workforce. And in our preliminary inquiry on why that might be, we see that autistic individuals seem to have difficulty navigating the employment process from recruitment to interviewing to hiring, and then sometimes also once in the workplace. And we do know from our research to date, but also drawing from workplace disability inclusion policies, workplace policies and practices inquiry in the past, that something can be done to mitigate these barriers. We can use improved workplace neurodiversity inclusive practices and workplace disability inclusive practices more broadly. So it's worth the conversation to say what we can be doing differently. Before I talk about the practices and the barriers we're observing, I wanted to level set the understanding of our participants here today and talk a bit about definitions around autism and neurodiversity. And I'm drawing broadly from a variety of different sources. So you'll see these particular ones are from 2006, 2015. It's the most common, autism specifically, is the most common member of a family called autism spectrum disorders, also known as pervasive developmental disability disorders. You'll hear me using different language. I'll probably talk about autism as a condition or just use the term autism. We're trying to be respectful of what the autism community tells us are their preferred terminology. And the umbrella around these terms are more often being used, neurodiversity or neurodivergence, in speaking about this population. The autism disorder, coming back to a more clinical look at this, is classified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as having 6 or more symptoms from a list of 12 possible symptoms, which the manual groups into 3 areas: difficulties in social interaction, communication, and sometimes behavior. But it's important to note, even though there are these classifications and these diagnostic criteria, that no 2 people with autism are the same. Its precise form or expression is different in every case, as we are more generally in human behavior and human conditions. And moreover, there may be a most intricate and potentially creative interaction between the autistic traits and the qualities of the individual. And it is these anomalies or distinct characteristics that has piqued the interest of employers these days, and why there is more concerted attention to addressing the barriers that prevent these individuals from accessing employment. So broadening the definition, and we think that this is important because there are employment barriers for people, many people throughout this neurodiversity spectrum. And so we think it's good to be able to start talking about how what we've learned might generalize to other populations. In the broader neurodiversity concept, these differences can include people with dyspraxia, dyslexia, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, dyscalculia, autism, as we talked about, Tourette syndrome, and others. And I've included in this slide some descriptions that give you more precise information about each of those, what might be unfamiliar terms. Dyspraxia is physical. Dyslexia is reading or interpreting words. ADHD, we hear a lot more about, as can manifest as inattention or difficulty focusing. Dyscalculia is difficulty in arithmetical calculations. Autism, we talked a bit about already, and Tourette syndrome can be demonstrated. It may demonstrate repetitive movements or unwanted sounds or tics that can't easily be controlled. So a little bit more about the umbrella of neurodiversity and the kinds of conditions that might cover. I'm hoping that this will show for us. Let's see if I can get this to come up. This is what I think is a really nice short neurodiversity YouTube video that gives us a nice little broad overview. Let's see if I can get this to show. Great.
Just like our fingerprints, all our brains are unique. But for the majority of people, their brains are similar enough that there are largely no obvious differences in how they function. They have differences in things like skills, preferences, and styles. But mostly, their brains mean they perceive the world in the same way. But for others, their brains are more fundamentally different. They have differences in things like social understanding, sensory processing, communication, and information processing. These differences are a result of neurological differences, such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and more. This natural variation in our brains is called neurodiversity. Those of us with no neurological conditions are neurotypical, and those of us with neurological conditions are neurodivergent. Neurodivergent people think differently. Their unique perspectives and experiences mean they can often excel at creativity and innovation, have highly specialized skill sets, and an ability to hyperfocus. If embraced, this can be a huge advantage to organizations and society. However, the differences neurodivergent people experience can make life challenging. In order to thrive at work, they often need some simple accommodations. For example, a sensory calm environment to recharge in, or a routine with the same start and end times. Approximately 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent, so not only is embracing neurodiversity critical for a truly inclusive organisation, but it also presents organisations with a huge opportunity.
All right, so I hope that was a useful addition to the overview I was providing about neurodiversity and autism and why we're interested in it. Again, I want to emphasize that, like all characteristics, there is a spectrum. I think we don't focus on the medical clinical terminology. We're looking more broadly at how that might manifest in getting a job and staying in the workplace. And we like to also emphasize what we're seeing as a difference in perspective right now in the employing environment, and the perception that many of these limitations can also be assets, particularly if workplaces take a neurodiversity perspective or inclusive perspective to cognitive differences, and if workers can be accepted as a part and these characteristics as a part of the normal human variation that we all are a part of. It's important to create support and awareness for both, not only the individual, but also for the supervisor who is affirmatively trying to work with a company that has affirmative hiring programs, which we're seeing an increasing number of, to tap this talent pool that has previously not been tapped. We're focusing on autistic job seekers in some of the research that we have been conducting over the last 3 or 4 years, because they have higher levels of unemployment, that should read, and underemployment than both people without disabilities and people with other types of disabilities. The disparities in employment exist for even autistic individuals who have above average education and qualifications to the rest of the workforce. So we see people coming out of college with computer science degrees which are dearly needed for many jobs that are going lacking now for applicants, and yet not making it through the screening and interview processes. And that's a barrier we would like to be able to address, because employers need the talent, want the talent. And they are also eager to understand how they might be unnecessarily limiting these candidates from their talent pool. We also know that the interview process, which is why we have focused on it, is particularly difficult for many autistic job seekers. And that's the first step if they make it through the screening process, if their application makes it through the screening process, where they often encounter not being able to make it through that. And companies are genuinely looking to people like ourselves, to service providers who support these candidates, and to researchers to figure out what can they do better. So it's nice to have them asking for the information. We do know that it's important to prepare the workplace as you know, I mentioned that many organizations are now actively pursuing candidates with disabilities. And candidates specifically who are neurodiverse. One of the things we really have found is helpful is they do some pre-thought to that process rather than just jumping in, and really prepare their workplace for these kinds of initiatives, as would be important with any affirmative recruitment process, but this seems to be particularly important with these candidates, and that they create a climate that is neurodiversity inclusive as they plan this process. So, and it's not just on the front end, although I'm going to be talking about the interview, it really needs to happen with thinking about your embedding it in your strategy for recruitment and human capital development, as well as the process in selection, interviewing, and making a good job match, as we should be doing with all candidates, right? But this is particularly where we're focused now. It's also important to think about neurodiversity in the job design and in the availability of what might be more oftenly occurring accommodation requests. Excuse me. It's also important to think about how this affirmative hiring interests will transition into career development and retention considerations, like equity in training and development opportunities, and not laying unnecessary limitations on what these candidates may be interested in, as well as equity and compensation and benefits, preparing employee relations or labor relations parts of your department, as well as health and safety departments. So having the whole workplace, all the services and policies and practices that surround good workplace practice prepared to support these candidates. Really important part of the process, as we have learned over the last 8 years. So one of the questions I always find interesting to look at in existing programs or to discuss with employers who are considering programs is where the program is situated. And there are potential strengths and weaknesses, as you might imagine, in putting these in any number of places. We often saw in the earliest days of interest and inquiry by many, especially tech-related companies, that they were positioning these initiatives in the technical areas that needed the new talent. And over time, that has changed. Many of them are now moving it into human capital talent management as a part of the more generalized human capital process. Some of them are included in diversity and inclusion, EEO or employment labor relations, although less so there. Very many more so in the job or content area where talent is being recruited. Less likely, although it's often under discussion or consideration in health and safety or occupational health, in case there are accommodation needs. It might be an accommodation unit or disability case management. I think it's important, those of you who might be employer representatives who are thinking about this and are on because you're interested in it, it's important to think about situating this in a place where supports will be available and understanding about the motivation of why this is important is embedded in this process. And that although you want the services to be available, that you are not flagging a preset or pre-perspective that this is a problem area, that rather that it is a part of really being an affirmative interest in the new talent. So there are promising recruiting practices that I want to talk about. One of the things we have found in our efforts is that candidates might select out of applying for a certain employer, even though they are ardently looking for the kind of job skills that the person may actually have, because of how the career pages are presenting information about the recruitment process. So it's really important for us to, as employers, to take a look at how are we presenting ourselves, and are we actually characterizing our recruitment efforts in a way that makes it more attractive. Developing more sophisticated career websites that appropriately brand the organization's hiring goals and contribute to more accurate and less exclusionary self-selection through employee. Such of the characteristics that we find people are looking for are employee testimonials, people who have the characteristics that you're recruiting for, who said that they've had a good experience, why they've chosen the organization, but also showing with the availability of perhaps targeted internships, besides testimonials of employees, information about the affirmative hiring program, information about relationships with community organizations that source neurodiverse talent. All of these things are signals to people that says the organization wants this kind of talent. So it's important to make that very easily accessible on the career website. Personalizing recruitment processes by allowing candidates to build up personal accounts on the website beyond just a impersonal application form or procedure, and engage in applicant tracking that involves recruiters and other collaborators is important, rather than just relying on algorithmic filters. We find that those filters might eliminate unnecessarily these kinds of candidates if they can come in through targeted portals or through targeted recruiters processes who've already, their awareness has been raised about the desire of the organization to recruit this talent. It heightens the likelihood that these types of candidates will get into the applicant pool. So moving on from the screening process and how people even get to this job interview process, which we just talked about, We, in our research, found out that there are definite barriers in the job interview process and interview environment. And we found this out from input from employers who are affirmatively recruiting, from autistic job seekers, as well as from the service provider employment organizations that provide supports to people to get to the work environment. We found out that some of the barriers, and it was reported across all three of those stakeholder cohort informants for us. The types of questions that were asked, if they were too open-ended or hypothetical, that was difficult. Personality profiles might be precluded depending on how they were shaped. If it was more personality focused than skills focused, that could be a barrier. People didn't necessarily understand how to answer some of those questions that interviewers were asking to try to get a handle on the person rather than the skill set. How the interview is structured also could pose a barrier. Large groups, multiple sequential interviews, long days of multiple interviews over the day rather than shorter interviews or fewer people. If the environment was noisy or overstimulating or had noxious odors or very bright lights, any of these things could also be off-putting and make it more difficult for the candidate to effectively interview. And how the recruiters or interviewers or hiring managers were trained or prepared for interviewing neurodivergent candidates also was a significant factor that posed a barrier. If they had not been, given some information about this being a desire of the company, there is an affirmative hiring program, that candidates might have certain characteristics or ways of interviewing that might be different than what they were used to, that also was an impediment. It was greatly facilitated that the outcome would be better when those employer professional representatives had been trained and educated in the affirmative hiring interests of the organization and what they might expect in interviewing candidates who had been targeted because of those characteristics. We also wanted to know, how could we help candidates better prepare? We work with service organizations, we work with schools who are supporting school to work transition. So it's important to have them upholding their end of this process towards success. We found that surprisingly, many organizations had little prior experience in preparing people concertedly for this job interview process. They might make the job match, but not support persons more concertedly in that part of that recruitment and job development process. They perhaps so the individual themselves had little prior job experience, as did sometimes supporting organizations. The job seekers may have had little prior work experience, a lack of familiarity with workplace settings. This might be their first job interview, or this particular job setting was one that they had no experience with. That might have been difficult for them. They might be challenged in addressing what was perceived to be ambiguous questions. I just referenced that. Some of these broader personality or how would you deal with questions would be difficult for them. They might have difficulty in explaining how their skills address job requirements, making that match. This is where coaching really helps. They might, by the nature of their characteristics, be awkward in what is usually expected social interaction in this interview process. And they may be made more anxious by a desire to camouflage or fake socially appropriate responses, which they believe the recruiter wants, and it's difficult for them. So that might heighten their anxiety, even though they've tried to prepare to do that. The expectation that they are anticipating makes it more difficult for them. And this is what we learned from job seekers, from employers themselves who'd had positive changes already made to their workplace policies and practices that really can make a difference. Employer strategies for more inclusive practice include autism awareness and sensitivity training for HR and hiring professionals prior to the interviews, modifying or replacing existing interview protocols, And examples might be of that, providing interview questions to interviewees in advance, which historically has not been very common for employers to do. They feel that it advantages them to see how individuals respond. It's very advantageous for the candidates to be able to know what's coming. Introduce applicants to the work environment prior to starting the interview as an icebreaker. So allowing them to come in, take a look at the room that they might be in, and navigating how to get to that room can really lessen anxiety. Consider replacing interview panels of 4 to 6 people with shorter one-on-one or 2-in-1 interview approaches, and replacing rapid fire questioning strategies with more slowly paced, even paced, allowing people to take a moment to respond, and eliminating open-ended and vague interview questions, and really focusing on technical skills rather than those personality or what would you do if kinds of questions, and allowing opportunities for the candidates to actually demonstrate their technical skills by solving a specific work relevant problem. And we did see those more seasoned companies who've been having success move toward this skills demonstration type of approach over a several day period, rather than a one-time verbal interview with candidates. That seemed to advantage many people. Not all need it, but those who do really were advantaged by that type of change in approach. So it's also important to think about, when you're designing these programs, if you want to affirmatively recruit and successfully expand your candidate pool, and if you want to be successful in pitching the idea of having an affirmative neurodivergent hiring program. These are many of the stakeholders who it's advantageous to bring into that conversation early on in program design. Top management CEO imperative. And if you can get a statement from that, that person or persons in your website that says this is a part of our strategic imperative to strategically recruit from historically underserved or underaddressed talent pools like neurodivergent people, it helps immensely. Having a designated champion, either from that leadership pool and or perhaps from trustees, very important. Enlisting the support of employees who are family members who may be able to serve as mentors or champions inside the organization later on. Supervisors, enlisting the help of supervisors, and maybe a subset who are family members who you start with, and expand that as you go along and the program gains momentum. Enlisting job applicants or recently hired individuals to help understand what works and doesn't work, very important. And looking for places where you can have conduits with community service providers or associations of family members in the community who might be referral sources, very important. And enlisting the support of family members within your organization that you might tap through ERGs perhaps. And there are other stakeholders, but thinking about how do you enlist support across all of these potential stakeholders is really important as you design these programs. This is going back to candidate preparation, how candidates can better prepare, pre-interview preparation, access to questions and ability to practice skills, preparation on how to present skills in the interview process, preparation in how to demonstrate skills or build a portfolio of examples of demonstrated expertise, prepare for select social interface expectations. If you know the questions, it may help immensely for the individual to be able to address some of these personality or more ambiguous questions. Building self-advocacy skills, asking for accommodations or breaks if needed, asking for time to think, to answer questions. This can be in the interview process or post-hire, and working with service providers who work with employers and recruiters to build their knowledge of neurodiversity and explore willingness to alter the traditional interview process, like breaks, questions in advance, clarification of unclear questions. So these bullets all represent things we encourage individuals to consider. And one of them is actually working with organizations that can support them in these kinds of preparation skills, really important. And making sure that the provider that you work with knows how to do these things. So I mentioned, I think I mentioned this already. I have a duplicate in here. So I think we talked about many of the things that would work. We focused on preparation skills. I also want to mention getting people to be able to advance once they're in there. The nature of neurodiversity identity, like diagnosis, is usually the least important things. Other things that we should be focusing on more broadly, once the person's in the work environment, is their own hesitation, their own anxiety. They may have self-limiting behaviors because they're concerned about being able to make the next leap. So having supervisors that support them is really important and give them equitable opportunity. And making sure that we address, as responsible agents in the workplace, stereotypes and stigmas that may be affecting the opinions and perceptions about competence by supervisors. And also being aware that what we're calling now intersectional identities for people may present an added disadvantage. People from racial ethnic minorities, autistic people who are also women, or from the LGBTQ identifying community. These kinds of things can also mean that there's added limitations in equity in the career development process. And it's important for us to be aware of that in supporting candidates and looking at equity in our workplace policies and practices. So it's important to prepare supervisors. These companies that have these programs have explored a wide variety of ways to help their supervisors be more successful. Some of them have internal training programs. Some of them have partnerships with external vendor-developed programs, and there are many more of these programs being developed. Some of these programs are several weeks in nature. And some of them are more targeted. Some of these supervisors are a part of a 6-week training program or orientation programs that the companies might have for candidates themselves, so that they get a sense of what the program is about, how candidates are performing. And companies have many tailored training programs of varying lengths. And companies also are aligning with service providers that can provide related training programs that support the companies over time and complement their own internal efforts. So as I mentioned, there are many more of these types of services surfacing. I think it's important to talk about supervisors because we know there are already many people, autistic people, neurodivergent people in the workforce, who are hesitant to come forward and would be able to flourish with more assuredness of being able to advance if they could talk about accommodations that they need. And this, more often, this disclosure of needing accommodations is more likely to occur to supervisors than HR. So educating this group is critically important. And thinking about what will support people to be able to feel comfortable coming forward. And it's important that we do that because indeed neurodivergent people are covered by our protections, like in the US for the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in order to be able to benefit from those legal protections and access accommodations, in the US, people need to say that they need the accommodations, and many individuals have concealable disabilities, and so are not willing to disclose unless they feel that it's a safe environment. So these decisions are not easy. They require careful consideration by the individuals. And not only does it mean it could preclude them from getting access to accommodations, but there's an increase in anxiety that comes along with having to hide or do identity management kinds of behaviors. And the work environment is a big predictor of whether or not people are comfortable coming forward. I have here a list of accommodations that questions to ask when you're exploring the accommodations. Look at what limitations the employee is experiencing, and the supervisor can provide help and feedback on this, and how those limitations affect job performance, what kinds of tasks are problematic as a result of the limitations, and what kinds of accommodations might specifically reduce or eliminate these problems. Has the employee been consulted? It's really important to have the conversation besides just observing what the limitations might be or the performance outcomes, but having a dialogue with the individual. And once the accommodations are in place, looking at whether or not it would be helpful to meet with the employee on an ongoing basis to determine if this is actually working. And in this process, looking at, do we need to also better educate our supervisors and employees about accommodations, and identifying issues as they arise, and more quickly moving in to help support the individual and getting the accommodation when needed. Some factors in the workplace that help with retention: clear job descriptions and clear performance expectations and timelines. True for all of us, but particularly true for this population. Training for supervisors, I mentioned about the equity and advancement opportunities and ways to approach performance issues that might reduce anxiety, and the value of mentoring systems, buddy systems, and facilitating social networks so that the person feels integrated in the workplace environment and can enjoy the other benefits of affiliation that come along with having a job that you enjoy and are good at. I can't talk enough about the value of employee resource groups in general, for people with disabilities and for around issues of neurodivergence, whether people are allies or people with neurodivergent characteristics themselves who might join these groups. They're most effective when senior management lends support. They can assist with candidate recruitment, identifying supervisors who might be willing to ally with these initiatives, and to provide what mentors and buddies when needed, to also help with identifying barriers and finding solution to those barriers, and supporting families or newly diagnosed individuals. Many individuals that we spoke with didn't know until much later, and sometimes because they'd had a child who was diagnosed, that indeed they themselves have these characteristics. It can also bring significant value when aligned with product development. If you have people who actually have these characteristics, who can provide input to that process. And it's important to network across other diversity groups, because as I mentioned, you can, in that alignment, can get more support for neurodivergent individuals who might have intersectional identities. I also want to talk about the importance of communications in this process. Working with your department of communications, marketing, and branding can help with branding supportive organizational events like April is Autism Month, leveraging the company intranet to talk about successes, raising awareness for support of this initiative, the creating messaging that is more affirmative and positive and not limiting, spotlighting this program in various communications, both inside and external to the organization, and helping with event planning. As I mentioned, Autism Awareness in April, but also the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which is December 3rd. All of this access to communications can greatly raise support for these kinds of initiatives. I here present one slide snapshot of all the parts of the employment process that should be considered, and I will leave that for your future reference because I'm trying to move quickly now, make sure we have time for questions. I believe I'm going to just quickly say this next slide here, I'm also quickly going to say is a summary of what I've just talked about, accessing progress, assessing progress across the employment process. I talked about each of these things: readying the workplace, recruitment, supervisor role, retention, thinking about climate for inclusion, using external and internal resources, internal and external communication, and thinking about, I have not talked about, the importance of sustainability and scalability over time. It's imperative that you do that, but also that you create a metrics and analytics process that allows the organization to assess how they're doing broadly across each of these features of what will lend to a truly successful process. So thinking about embedding that in your existing metrics and analytics, or creating metrics and analytics that will assess this, should be an important part of the overarching approach to designing one of these affirmative hiring programs. And with that, I will mention that I share here online recruitment related resources generally that are ones that relate to what I have said broadly are good practices, not just for neurodiverse individuals, but good practices in general, but more broadly for people with disabilities. And I share here some of our academic resources that are targeted on neurodiversity related resources in particular that are available online with the links that I have provided you. I want to acknowledge that the research that I have shared with you about neurodiversity hiring and disability affirmative workplace inclusion practice policies and practices are from two sources: the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability and Employment Policy, and also from the National Science Foundation, who have supported this work. With that, I'm going to pause and turn it back over to Dan to help us to identify the questions that have come up in the chat. Thank you, Dan, in advance. You're on mute, Dan.
Can you hear me now?
I can, thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Susanne. Really appreciate the presentation and the practical focus of it. I want to make sure for everyone in the audience, also there's like almost 150 people here, which is pretty amazing. If you do have a question, please type it into the Q&A. We only have a bit of time left, so we won't be able to get to every question, but please send us an email and we can always answer your questions later as well. Something that really struck me too in all of the advice that you shared is that some of this advice is good advice for organizations and interviewers, regardless of who we're talking about, whatever community we're relating to, especially things on like work-based tasks, skill-based tasks, rather than these sort of more personal questions, replacing panels with one-on-one interviews, this sort of thing. And I also really appreciate how you mentioned many of the different actors in the system: employers, supervisors, managers, persons who are job candidates, also intermediary organizations. And we have one question here that's about another one of the kind of actors in this system. And the question asker posed the question: what role can the union play in championing inclusion in this space?
That's a great question. We have always, because we're in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, really thought about how can we engage unions in affirmatively supporting this. And I think they definitely can play a role. I think, you know, worker rights is one of the things that unions are the guardians of. And that has also been true around disability, protecting the interests of their employees who are already incumbents in the job when they become ill or injured, especially if it's an occupational related injury, but otherwise as well. And I think this is another area where the union can support the affirmative hiring and the retention and equitable access to career advancement for neurodivergent individuals. And again, that means that you know, there's education about this, that there is an appreciation of differences and characteristics and how people might approach work, and supporting individuals, but the bigger picture perspective of neurodivergence as a part of the human condition and human variation, and a characteristic that is to be supported and appreciated. And, helping to minimize some of the negative things we see, like bullying, that might occur and when people have these types of characteristics. And unions can be terrific allies across all of these things.
And our next question is about entrepreneurship and whether you can share about if there's research on autism, neurodiverse identities, and entrepreneurship.
There is some preliminary work. I can't give you a specific citation off the top of my head, but I have sat on panels of researchers and it was international representation, who are across the globe interested in this. Not surprisingly, a part of that is because, I think there's lots of reasons, but we do know that there's some research about people with neurodivergent characteristics being also very entrepreneurial and having part of those characteristics being advantageous in the entrepreneurial process. So we're interested in finding out, is this another area where we can promote and capitalize on those skills and advantage people and minimize barriers where they have experienced them in the past. We do also know that reportedly, people with disabilities more broadly, and neurodivergent characteristics might have a harder time getting venture capital, getting approval from banks for loans to capitalize small businesses and entrepreneurial ventures. And we want to make sure that we minimize those limitations and those disadvantagements and barriers, which is disequitable. So yes, there's interest and there's good reason to, and there is some preliminary work being done. It's coming. That's, I guess, what I can best say about that.
And our next question reads from an anonymous attendee, I'm autistic and often have to ask so many clarifying questions during interviews because interviewers' open-ended questions are not precise in their wording. My question is, how can we train those conducting interviews to word their questions more precisely and in a straightforward manner so that the burden is not always placed on the autistic person to change their communication?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more that the responsibility is really shared between employers making changes in their processes, as well as us as individuals who are preparing for these interview processes to anticipate some of these things and prepare ourselves. It is a shared responsibility, which is why we approach our research the way we do. And I think it's also shared by those kinds of organizations that support people in this process, the employment service providers. It's slow in coming. It is coming. I would say particularly those organizations that are now affirmatively recruiting, and there's many of them, they are doing a better job in this process. And my hope is that, as Dan flagged for us, that our awareness of how we unnecessarily eliminate candidates who have been marginalized in the past, historically, of many, many different kinds, that we will do a better job of making these kinds of changes, of being more focused on skills and allowing people to demonstrate their skills rather than just have to verbally interview, and maybe that's not people's strong point, and we needlessly eliminate them as viable candidates from the job search process.
And our next question is about peers and coworkers in the workplace. So our question asker has asked, I would be interested in hearing strategies on how to encourage peer employee acceptance and inclusion. Often this is the hardest aspect of inclusion if accommodations are seen as inequities between employees.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's not new just to people who are neurodivergent. It's something that when we have workplace accommodation provisions, regulations that that are designed to prohibit discrimination, accommodation is a part, expectations of employers is a part of that. That's always been an issue of concern. And again, here's a place where broadly educating the workforce is critically important. And although I think we're talking about neurodiversity, and I think that is targeting that as, I think where we see the most success is in backing way up, is where it's made very clear to supervisors, very clear to the workforce as a whole, that this affirmative hiring initiative is not only nice, it's a strategic imperative, and that there's an expectation that everyone will step in and support it. And that, there is an expectation of civility among employees, that accommodation is a right of people to have across a whole host of different characteristics, and that people are expected to respect that. What we found in our research, that 95% of accommodation requests come from people, this is from national census data, other than those with disabilities. And I think it's important for employers and supervisors to let people know they're asking for accommodations all the time. It's being given, and to recognize that this is just a part of that process, and not just special to a person, just special to a person with a disability or one who is neurodiverse.
Thank you. And so we just have a few minutes left. In that time, Susanne, I wanted to ask if you just have any last point that you might want to make.
I think I just want to make the point that I appreciate, first of all, people's interest, and any of you who have joined us today. I appreciate your curiosity about, or your maybe already concerted investment in this area. I think neurodiversity can really help us, because there is such a large proportion of people who represent these characteristics, in making our workplaces more generally inclusive for a much broader spectrum of people. So I appreciate your attention, and please do let Dan and our sponsors know if you have other questions. I'm happy to continue to share resources with them as a conduit. So please do come back to us if you need for future information. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susanne. And thank you to everyone who asked questions and attended. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to every question. Tried to get to a range of them, though. Please do send us those questions, though, because I'm happy to answer more. Susanne is happy to answer more, and our team as well. I do also just want to thank the team who helps make this all possible. Ekam Grawal, Therese Solanix, Sabrina Chowdhury, Emil Tompa, and Rebecca Goertz. Our next presentation is going to be February 23rd with Mahadeo Sukai from the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. So thank you everyone again so much for joining us for a bit of your Friday, and have a nice weekend.